أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين ولا عدوان إلا على الظالمين ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله ولي الصالحين ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله إمام الخلق والمرسلين صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. Inshallah, before we proceed, before we say a word, as you can hear, Ikhwani, if you're blocking anyone, please, Jazakumullah khair, go remove your car and come back. Inshallah, you'll find us here. We're not going anywhere. So if you're blocking anyone, please, Jazakumullah khair, go remove your car and come back. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. Tonight, inshallah, Ikhwani, we're continuing on with the series about Palestine and Al-Quds and Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. This very important series which talks about one of the holiest lands on the face of the planet. What's so important about Palestine? What's so important about Al-Aqsa? What's so important about Jerusalem? What makes that land more important than other pieces of land? What makes Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa more important than the masjid that we're in tonight, Ikhwani? It is enough that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Almighty, the one who creates and chooses amongst His creation, has chosen that location, chosen Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa to be Al-Masjid, the mosque which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed, and also blessed its surrounding. It is enough that, Ikhwani, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Almighty, is the one that said in the Quran, and every time that the land of Palestine or the Masjid Al-Aqsa or Al-Quds was mentioned or were mentioned, that the words Muqaddasa, Ard Mubaraka, Ard Muqaddasa, ila al-Masjid Al-Aqsa alladhi barakna hawla, that to the Aqsa mosque which we have blessed the surrounding of. It is enough of that, Ikhwani. Let alone what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said. Let alone the messengers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those who continued to travel throughout the centuries, one by one, messenger by messenger, and prophet by prophet, and after prophet, and Nabi after Nabi, to Al-Ard Al-Muqaddasa, to the Holy Land. It is enough that the companions radiallahu anhum, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has opened up this land to the Muslims, they all went, and so many of them went in the tents to seek permission from Umar radiallahu anhu to go and live in Al-Ard Al-Muqaddasa, in the Holy Land. And Ikhwani, it is enough that the East and the West will try to take off that land of us, and they have. Just like they've done in the past, and they've done to us today. And tonight, inshallah, we'll find out what exactly happened in the past, Ikhwani. What made the Muslims lose Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa? And inshallah tonight, for those who have been with us, inshallah, I'm going to summarize what's been happening over the past 3 weeks, inshallah, in a few words, in a few moments, inshallah, in a few words as well. We had, at the Khilaf of Umar radiallahu anhu, Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, Jerusalem, Palestine enter the fold of Islam, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed the Muslims by allowing them to capture Jerusalem, and as a consequence, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opened up so many lands and cities in Palestine in the Khilaf of Umar radiallahu anhu. Then the trust of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, of Al-Quds and Palestine went to Al-Khilafa Al-Amawiyya. After Al-Khulafa Rashidin, we had Al-Khilafa Al-Amawiyya. The Amawis, Ikhwani, were the cousins of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And even the cousins of Uthman radiallahu anhu. They were, to an extent, people, some of them were righteous, some of them were not so righteous, etc. However, they've done what they can. They were amongst the first who built Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, who have decorated it, built Qubbat Al-Sakhra, and so on. However, after they fell, Al-Khilaf Al-Amawi, after it fell, we had a transition into Al-Khilaf Al-Abbasiyya, who were also concerned with Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. They looked after Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, they protected Palestine, initiated cities in Palestine itself. We had a city called Ar-Ramla, which wasn't in existence before, Ikhwani, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed the Muslims to establish a new city. And we had other cities being established. And we had trade routes where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed the Muslims to trade within Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa and within Palestine and flourish these lands, and allow the people to migrate to Palestine and to Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, may they be Muslims or non-Muslims. And we'll talk about the non-Muslim part. May they be Muslims or non-Muslims to flourish in those lands. And we had even Khulafa of the Muslims, Islamic Khulafa, who had peace treaties with non-Muslim countries to protect their civilians. For example, the Christian Empire had a treaty with Harun al-Rashid, where if a non-Muslim, we're talking about a Christian or even a Jew, if they wanted to travel, specifically a Christian, if they wanted to travel from their country all the way to Jerusalem, the moment they entered Muslim lands, they were under the protection of who? The Muslim armies, ikhwani. It was our responsibility to even look after the Christian pilgrims. And they were under our protection. As the Prophet ﷺ said in the hadith, "Min ada dhimmiyan faqad adani." The Christians who we have a peace treaty with, especially those who live in our countries, if you, and as long as the peaceful Christians and Jews, if you harm them, it's as if you harm the Prophet ﷺ. And we continue on, ikhwani, to summarize what we spoke about last week, where from the time of Harun al-Rashid till about 300 Hijri, the Muslim lands were stable, Palestine was flourishing, Al-Quds was flourishing as a city, Jerusalem was becoming a capital for civilization, a capital for spirituality, a capital to attract investors and traders, a capital in every possible angle. It was prospering in every possible angle. However, that did not stay for long, ikhwani. What was happening in the Muslim world? The Muslim empire was becoming like a very old man. What happens to you as an old man, akhi? Your body parts begin to wear out. And fragmentation began within the ummah, from within inside the ummah. And we had deviant groups working in the background for centuries, waiting for an opportunity. Within the body, within the human body, ikhwani, there are bacteria or viruses, and they're opportunistic. They wait for an opportunity to flourish. Similar to that, we had Islamic deviant groups waiting to flourish when the ummah was down. And as we said last week, we had a group, we had normal Shias who started to cause problems. They started spreading from Morocco to Algeria to Libya and eventually invaded Egypt. So we had Masr, Egypt, one of the strongest holds, one of the strongest countries in the Muslim lands, under a Khilafah Fatimiyya. They want to link themselves to Fatima Zahra, radiallahu anha, the daughter of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Fatima has nothing to do with them, ikhwani. They call it Al-Khilafah Al-Fatimiyya, the Muslims call it Al-Khilafah Al-Batiniyya. So here we have a Shia state in North Africa. We also had extremist Shia groups. One example was called a group called Al-Qaramita. These guys were from a particular Shia sect called Al-Ismailiyya. Very extremist views. They actually considered normal Shia to be out of the fold of Islam. So you could imagine what they considered Sunnis. These guys went and took over Bahrain and then started to attack the Muslims, Sunni or Shia. They did not care. And as we said last week, this group in particular was one of the most extreme. They went all the way to Mecca, attacked the Kaaba, broke the Kaaba, took out the black stone, killing as many people in the way as possible, grabbing the black stone, Al-Hajar al-Aswad, taking it all the way to Bahrain, building their own Kaaba and placing the black stone there. Can you imagine the situation of the Ummah? How weak was the Ummah, ikhwani? Then we had the third group, also Shia, dissecting and dividing from another Shia group, from the Ismailiyya. So we have normal Shia, then strict Shias, one of their groups are called Ismailiyya. From the Ismailiyya, from the womb of the Ismailiyya sect, we had a group called Al-Hashashin. And tonight, these Hashashin, and as the name states, they actually use hashish to get intoxicated and achieve their goals. What are their goals? They want to prosper, they want to take over, they had assassinations, they will even hide as assassins. We'll see tonight how the non-Muslims used to pay them off to go assassinate leaders of the Muslim armies. The non-Muslims, the Christians, will pay this Muslim group money to go assassinate mujahideen and leaders of mujahideen and leaders of Islamic states. We'll find all that out tonight, inshallah. Then the beginning of the end, as we said last week, when a crazy man managed to get to the rule of Egypt. His name was Al-Hakimu bi-Amrillah. This man, as we said, was actually mentally ill, crazy. As the historians would tell us, they used to call him, nickname him the Majnoon. Al-Majnoon, the crazy man. What was wrong with this man, ikhwani? He was asking people, do not eat this, eat that. Do not marry from here, marry from there. Do not work in the day, work at night, sleep in the day. Who would force these people to do the craziest of things? And surprisingly, ikhwani, the ummah was forced and subjected to his orders. He was so crazy, he sparked the beginning of the Crusade Wars, which we're talking about tonight. He ordered his soldiers and his troops to go to Christianity's holiest site. Imagine Christianity's holiest site and go destroy the #1 church in the Christian world. Kanisatul Qiyamah was destroyed by this man. Imagine 400 years of Islamic rule. Their pilgrims were our responsibility. We protected them. Now comes this crazy Fatimi who ruled Egypt. When I say Fatimi Ikhwani, they're the Shia, it's a particular Shia group who ruled Egypt and who also had rulership over Palestine. He ordered his troops to go and destroy Christianity's holiest site, sparking the beginning of the end of the Shia sort of overtake of the Muslim lands, at the same time sparking the Crusade Wars. For the past 2-3 centuries, the Crusaders, Europe, when I say Crusaders, we're talking about the Franks, the French, the British, the Germans, the Polish, those countries, who were mainly dominantly Christian, were going through a reformation of their religion. They had in 454 Hijri, for example, they dissected. We had Orthodox Christians and Catholic Christians, and then Catholics turned into a bit more extreme than Orthodox and started the Crusaders. They were doing their own dawah in their own way, and getting people back into their religion and pumping people up. And sadly enough, people were so poor there that imagine you were so poor you could not have enough food to eat that day. No enough clothes to keep you going, not enough anything, and then someone offered you, look, we'll feed you, just join the army. People had no other option. They'll join the army. Farmers, people off the street, people in prisons. They'll drown them up, prey on them, and send them off. To where? The Holy Lands. Where's the Holy Lands? Palestine, Jerusalem, Al-Quds, even parts of Asham. And they heard so much about the Muslim world. The Muslim world is fighting each other. The Muslim countries are at each other's necks. The Muslims have broken into Mecca and took the Kaaba, and all these things have been passed on to the non-Muslim world. So they looked at the Muslim world as this extremely old man, which can be broken down or hurt with the smallest of touches. And here we have, Ikhwani, the Crusade Wars begun. What instigated it was this crazy man who destroyed the church. However, it was something in the subconscious mind of the Christian world for a very long time to invade the Muslim world and to capture Jerusalem back to their countries or to their faith. And in the year, Ikhwani, 477 Hijri, I remember this name, we have a particular person, a new pope. His name was Father Gregory. Hello, what's so different about this pope than all the other popes? This man had one mission, and one mission only: to take over Al-Quds, Jerusalem, and invade it to Christianity. That was his mission in life. Like if you grab any person and you tell them, what do you want to do in your life? He'll tell you, I want to collect money, I want to get married, I want to do this. This man had one thing, he was programmed: must capture Jerusalem. That's all he wanted, this man. And what did he do, Ikhwani? He rounded up troops. 477 Hijri, this man was elected. 480, about 2.5 years later, the first crusade sailed all the way to Antakya. Who did they meet there, Ikhwani? They met Turkish brothers who were a young Islamic nation, Turks, young Muslim nation, holding on to the Quran, the Sunnah, one of the strongest nations back then, who was on the haqq. So we have these crusaders who weren't trained, people of farms, people in jail. They just shipped them. They just want to make a statement. When these crusaders landed on the shores of our Turkish brothers eliminated them. They say about 90,000 of them were creamed. And that sent a very strong message to the crusaders back in Europe. Don't just send us anyone, send us your best boys. And that's exactly what happened in the following year, Ikhwani. This Father Gregory, after killing 80,000 people of his own people, he realized, I needed to round up better troops. So now he started to work on the princes and the leaders of the Christian armies. Within a year or two, Ikhwani, he sends in his second crusade, 480 Hijri. From 490 Hijri. And this crusade, Ikhwani, was very different. Here we have the princes, the leaders of the Christian armies, the leader of the British army, the leader of the Polish army, the German army, the French army. First of all, these armies have internal problems. However, they were unified against one common enemy, called the Muslims. And these armies, Ikhwani, in 490, landed to our Turkish brothers again. However, our Turkish brothers could not carry, or weren't equipped enough to be able to outstand them. As a consequence, they were able to break the Turks and invade parts of Turkey as it's known today and advance towards Al-Masjid, Al-Aqsa and Jerusalem and Al-Quds. And they broke the Turkish army so much that the Turkish nation, which was so young and full of life and, you know, aspiring to become a strong nation, was divided into 5 little nations. That's how much damage they have caused amongst them. And now we have a crusading army, Ikhwani. They want one thing. And remember what they want, Ikhwani. They want Jerusalem. They want Al-Quds. They're not really interested in, you know, Turkey, Sham, parts of Palestine. No, no. Just one city, Jerusalem, Al-Quds. And you'll see this. As they were advancing, Ikhwani, from the north down south towards Al-Quds, we had young and little Muslim nations. For example, we had northern Syria, as it's known today. We had, you know, Halab, Homs, etc. Little nations. They did not even look at them. However, one Muslim leader, who happens to be the leader of Tripoli, as it's known today, Tarablis, decided no, and he realized what was happening. He realized that these armies are going to Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa and Al-Quds, and he realized the consequences of that. He fortified his city and started to attack the Franks. The Crusaders have no interest in him. We have no interest in Tripoli. So this man started attacking the armies of the Franks so much, and the Crusaders so much, that now the Crusaders decided to change their direction, get rid of this man, and they surrounded the city of Tripoli. Some narrations tell us for about 6 years. Some tell us for about a year or so. Tripoli was surrounded by the crusading armies for about a whole year until it fell. And Ikhwani, for a whole year, the whole Muslim world, I'm talking from the east to the west, watched as Tripoli was surrounded and under constant bombardment by armies from the Crusaders, and the Muslim world did not do anything. And the day they actually announced the surrender was the very same day that they sent a messenger to Egypt. As we said earlier, Egypt was ruled by the Shia Fatimiyin. So they sent a messenger to him via the sea. So the messenger comes back with the news. They sent him a message saying, look, we're surrounded, help us. So the news comes back. The king or the head of the Fatimiyin sends him a message saying, I heard of a beautiful young Tripolian lady by the name of so-and-so. I want to buy her. And you guys in Lebanon have particular pieces of wood or particular trees that I want to make musical instruments out of. Send me that tree and send me those pieces of wood. When the Tripolians read the message of the Fatimi king, the letter was dropped out of the Tripolian man's hands, and they announced their surrender to the Franks. And now the Crusaders into Tripoli, till this day, Ikhwani, you go to Tripoli. I was in Tripoli about 8 weeks ago. Till this day, you find the leftovers of the crusading war, Jazakallah khair, of the Crusaders who invaded nearly 1,000 years ago. Till this day, you find their leftovers. Subhanallah. Since when Bilad al-Sham or Lebanon or Palestine would know a person with, you know, extremely white skin, with red hair, etc.? They all came from Europe, Ikhwani. And throughout time, they diluted, they became Muslims, some of them were enslaved, some of them were, you know, every one of them has his own story. But that's their leftovers in the people that were in Tripoli. After invading Tripoli, Ikhwani, they invaded the whole of Lebanon, going to Beirut, going to other cities, and heading towards Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa and Jerusalem. Ikhwani, as I said earlier, they had one target, and one target only, Al-Quds. And that's why we're here tonight, Ikhwani. This Quds, this city, that a lot of us, or the majority of us, weren't even alive when it was captured. These crusade wars, Ikhwani, what would make the British Prime Minister or the British general of the armies, when they entered into Jerusalem about 60 years ago, make an announcement and say, today we have ended the Crusade Wars. Habibi, the Crusade Wars finished 1,000 years ago. That's what we think. These guys finished it 60 years ago. But has it truly finished? What made Goro, the French leader of the armies, of the French armies, when he entered into Syria, he entered into Damascus with his armies about 100 years ago, go all the way to the grave of who? Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, and kick it. And in one narration, he took out his sword and hit the grave of a dead man, and he said, here we are, Salah ad-Din. What would make him think that? Why would they go to Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi's grave? Why would they announce that the Crusade Wars have finished? Because we think it's finished, Ikhwani. But for them, it hasn't finished. We go back to the Crusaders. As they invaded city by city, Ikhwani, they had certain movements within the Muslim world trying to bring back the Muslims to the Deen, back to the Quran, back to the Sunnah. As we said, we had Al-Fatimiyin in Egypt, we had Al-Qaramita, we had Al-Ismailiyya. We had certain groups within the Muslims world which have divided the Muslims into so many bits and pieces, fighting each other, accusing each other, having assassinations against each other. And here we have the Crusaders coming with no real resistance in the Muslim world. One interesting thing, Ikhwani, that took place as well, is that whilst our Turkish brothers, the Turks, were fighting the Crusaders, the Fatimiyin and the Crusaders, about 20 years prior to that, were able to combine Palestine and Al-Quds to their state. While our Turkish brothers, who have taken over Palestine and Al-Quds, its affairs, looking after it, while they're fighting the Crusaders, during that war, the Fatimiyin went behind their backs, invaded Al-Quds, invaded Palestine, invaded some parts of Bilad al-Sham. So here you have the Turks fighting the Crusaders from one side, and the Fatimiyin are going behind their back to invade Al-Quds. So now the Crusaders are advancing towards Jerusalem, and who's got ownership of Jerusalem? Who sort of invaded it recently was what? Al-Fatimiyin, who we said earlier were a deviant Shia sect which started in Morocco or started in certain parts of Africa and moved on to Egypt. In the year 492 Hijri, Ikhwani, and remember this date, Sha'ban, in the midst of Sha'ban, the Crusader army has surrounded the walls of Jerusalem for 42 days. 42 days, the Crusaders have surrounded Jerusalem, bombarding the city, bombarding the people. And who are the soldiers, Ikhwani? They were actually Shia soldiers who came from Egypt, paid or unpaid, Allahu Alam, and they were trying to protect the city. They sent asking for reinforcements from Egypt, from their leadership. Their leadership ignored them. Ruhu, we have no interest in you. So after 42 days of being surrounded, this Shia Hamia, the Shia mini army, which was protecting Jerusalem, gathered all its troops in 1 hour, left all the walls of the city, the doors of the city, left all parts of the city and ran towards a particular castle and fortified themselves in that castle, leaving the city to be vulnerable. Can you imagine a whole city? Jerusalem, for those who haven't seen it, it's actually a beautiful city to visit. Imagine a whole city with no soldiers. And there's about 150 to 200,000 people outside wanting to invade. Can you imagine the situation? So the people were like, the Muslims of the city were like, where's the army? The Egyptian army just disappeared. Ran to our castle and fortified themselves in it. And the Crusaders entered from every single angle you could possibly imagine, Ikhwani. From the doors, from the top of the walls, from on top of they had the like robes, whatever they had, and they've entered into the city. And Ikhwani, the commanders of the armies, of the Crusader armies, and do not go back to Muslim sources, go back to Christian sources, please. Don't go to Ibn al-Athir, don't go to Muslim sources. I want you to go back to Christian and Crusader sources, which will tell you how much they've killed of the Muslims on those days. In Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, one priest narrates that they've killed so many people that the blood reached all the way up to the knees. So much so that bodies, Muslim bodies, were floating on the blood. It wasn't only Muslims, ikhwani. They surrounded the synagogue of the Jews. 6,000 Jews were burnt alive in their synagogue. So it wasn't just Muslims, it was anything that moved. Even Arab Christians suffered some forms of torture. Can you imagine? So these crusaders, ikhwani, it wasn't sort of a religious or a spiritual uplifting experience for them to be at the Holy Lands. It was more of a murder, mass murder, a mass-scale murder where they killed, in Muslim narrations, it gets up to 600,000. Go to Crusader narrations, we're talking the hundreds of thousands were killed. And they acknowledged that, ikhwani, in their books of history. And for days, the killing continued and continued up until the Crusader soldiers stopped killing simply because there were so many dead bodies, you could not walk in the streets. The smell of the corpses was so bad that you could not do anything. You could not live in this city anymore. And they stopped the killing, ikhwani. But after what? After killing hundreds of thousands of people, after taking over the sovereignty of one of the holiest cities on earth, after having a non-stop waterfall of blood that only stopped days later as they killed so many people. And here we have, ikhwani, a city which was taken over by the Crusaders. The moment that the Muslim cities surrounding it heard of the killing, of the mass killings, the burning, the raping, and so on, they all sent in their convoys. We surrender. So Nablus surrendered, other cities surrendered, Ar-Ramla, etc. They surrendered. They had the right to surrender. Who would want to face what Al-Quds faced? In that day, ikhwani, when they killed just in one day more than 100,000 souls in the masjid. Who can face that? When entire, not families, entire tribes were wiped out completely from the face of the planet in one day. Who can face that, ikhwani? Ibn al-Athir, rahimahullah, after witnessing some parts of these massacres, and I'll summarize it here, and I'll move on from it. He said, لَيْتَ أُمِّي لَمْ تَلِدْنِي. I wish, after witnessing that day, I wish if my mother never gave birth to me. Can you imagine the extent of what happened on that day? Just the day that the Crusaders entered to the Masjid al-Aqsa. Ikhwani, we talk about this, and we stress on this point, because compare when Umar radiallahu anhu entered to the Masjid al-Aqsa, entered into Jerusalem, entered into Palestine, compare Umar's mercy with them 400 years later, when the whole of humanity was supposed to advance. What happened to them? Compare Umar radiallahu anhu, who gave them the oath of Umar, al-Uhd al-Umariyya, the promise of Umar, where they were protected by the Muslims and their armies till that day. Compare that to them entering the city, ikhwani. Compare that, by Allah. Ikhwani, while all this was happening, we had a few things also happen in the background. We had some of the greatest scholars of the time, who started about 80 years before that, trying to wake up the ummah. And without mentioning names, etc., we had so many scholars of Islam, some of the greatest mujaddideen, who existed at that time, and about 100 years to 80 years to 60 years before that, starting schools to re-educate the ummah, to bring back the ummah to Islam, to bring back the ummah to the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to bring back the ummah to the Quran, the Sunnah. As we said, the ummah was invaded by Shia forces. Some were extremists, some weren't, who have taken over. Now the scholars of Islam are trying to bring them back. And the fall of Al-Masjid al-Aqsa in Jerusalem, ikhwani, instigated more movements, more Islamic movements towards bringing the Muslims back. And these movements, ikhwani, saw some of its fruits in the year 505 Hijri, when we had one of the leaders of the Muslims. As we said, the Muslims were divided into so many cities and towns. One of their leaders was called Mawdud, the leader of Al-Mosul. This man, he was fed up with what he saw, and he's seen the convoys of the Muslims come from Jerusalem, from Palestine, with the continuous slaughter of Muslims. And the messengers that keep coming from cities which were invaded by the Crusaders, keep coming to Mawdud saying, when are you going to come and free al-Masjid al-Aqsa? So here's Mawdud, Ikhwani, declaring one thing, and one thing only. Hayya ala al-jihad. The moment he declared that, thousands of people flocked from all over the Muslim world and gathered in the city of Al-Mosul. Al-Mosul, Ikhwani, is in northern Iraq today. Gathered in that city, and this young leader, or this young Islamic movement, started to progress towards Al-Masjid al-Aqsa. So they took over a few cities, and then done a few movements, and alhamdulillah, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them success. They even went into a major battle with the Christians. However, they could not, no army could break the other one, so they retreated to Damascus. SubhanAllah, he went back to Damascus, Ikhwani, this Muslim leader, went back to Damascus to just organize his men, organize his soldiers, organize his generals, get more weapons, reorganize his army. On the day of Jummah, he goes to Salat al-Jummah, as we all do. Who comes out of the blue? This group that we said earlier called Al-Hashashin. They sent an assassin who was paid by the Crusaders. Can you imagine these deviant sects and what they've done in the history of Islam? They sent an assassin while this person is praying, the leader of the Muslims, while he's praying, he is assassinated. And after he was assassinated, his armies crumbled, his armies divided, and we have his own towns and cities began to fragment, and that movement was killed in its birth. And subhanAllah, the hope that the Ummah had to bring back Al-Masjid al-Aqsa to the fold of Islam has just vanished. So now the Muslims are looking for another opportunity. Between the years 507 Hijri to 538 Hijri, Ikhwani, so many other movements tried to begin. However, the Crusaders, let alone the Fatimiyyin, let alone the Hashashin, let alone all these deviant sects, let alone bad rulers and evil rulers who were too concerned about their chairs, so many factors demolished all these movements. However, in the year 539 Hijri, a man by the name of Imaduddin Zanki. And Ikhwani, this man was not an Arab. And in that there's a point, especially to the Arab brothers and sisters, that Allah's religion does not favor anyone. Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. That the best of you in the eyesight of Allah is who? The Arab? La Allah. The one that has more fear, more taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Here we have this man who wasn't an Arab, who was appointed by the Khalifa to be the head of Al-Mosul. And we notice the names of certain cities like Al-Mosul, Damascus. And believe it or not, every time the Muslims freed Al-Masjid al-Aqsa, it went through Damascus. And that's why there's a big battle today where? In Damascus. So the road to Al-Masjid al-Aqsa, Ikhwan, is through where? Damascus. So whenever you do sujood, whenever you do dua, whenever you worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, make dua, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives victory to the mujahideen where? Today, tonight, that are in Damascus. This man, Ikhwani, who was raised by the scholars of Islam, raised by the correctional movements which existed at the time, raised by the mujahideen, raised on he was breastfed jihad from a young age, knowledge, iman, taqwa, and he was an extremely intelligent man, and he was a very smart man. It's not enough for him to be a taqi to lead the Muslims, Ikhwani. It's not enough for him to be just a smart intellectual to lead the Muslims. This man had a few things going for him, including the fact he's a taqi, strong, intelligent, knowledgeable, also a politician who knows how to deal with people. He is a natural leader, and so many other beautiful qualities that gave us the perfect leader in Imaduddin Zanki, rahimahullah. And Imaduddin Zanki, Ikhwani, started something different. He declared jihad, which Mawdud started about 40 years before him. He also declared that Muslim states must unite, whether willingly or unwillingly. So some states, when I say states, we're talking about some cities, you know, like imagine Bankstown, Canterbury, you know, like a couple of councils around us, Parramatta. That was back then a country. You know, like you drive from one side to the other, 20 minutes, half an hour. It was a country, it had a king, it had an army, a mini king, a mini currency, but it was considered to be a country. He forced all these mini countries to combine. However, some cities refused. So he would start to add them by force to the United Muslim cities, if you want to call them. And he formed, ikhwani, a very good group of cities. In 2 years, this man was able to unite so many Muslim cities and countries. In 2 years, ikhwani, this man was able to raise an Islamic army. In 2 years, ikhwani, he was able to threaten the Crusaders in Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa and Jerusalem. In 2 years, ikhwani, he reignited jihad in the Ummah. And in 2 years, ikhwani, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed him to open up so many cities. And every time he had an encounter with the Crusader army, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him victory. At a time where the Ummah was so low in its morale, the Ummah had no victory in a very long time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave this man victory after victory. Up until one day, he was surrounding a castle for the non-believers. And then the same thing that happened 40 years ago happens on that night. Here he is asleep, and the Hashashin, the drug dealers of the Ummah, the deviant Shia group, sent in their men in the middle of the night, went all the way to his tent and assassinated him. SubhanAllah, imagine these deviant groups, ikhwani. They leave the bad leaders, they leave the bad khulafa, they leave the crusaders, they leave the armies of the enemies, and they come to the leaders of the Muslims. And they assassinate them one after the other. However, the only difference here, ikhwani, when Mawdud passed away or was assassinated, rahimahullah, the Muslim nation was fragmented. When Imaduddin Zanki, rahimahullah, was assassinated, his children took over, and especially Nuruddin Zanki, one of the greatest men in the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and his name should be remembered till the Day of Judgment. Nuruddin Zanki, ikhwani, remember this name. Whenever we talk about the Crusaders, we always mention the name Salah ad-Din. The name Salah ad-Din is such a great name, ikhwani. However, do you want to know a name that's greater than Salah ad-Din? Nuruddin Zanki. Who was this man, ikhwani? Some of the scholars of Islam would consider him to be Al-Khalifa Al-Adil Al-Sadis. So after Abu Bakr, after Umar, Uthman, Ali, after the 4 righteous Khulafa, some scholars will tell you Umar bin Abdul Aziz is the 5th. Who's the 6th? A lot of the scholars of Islam will tell you that Nuruddin Zanki is the 6th righteous Khalifa of the Muslims. Who was this man, ikhwani? Nuruddin, the son of Imaduddin Zanki. Was he an Arab? No, he wasn't. He was a Turkmani. Another group of, another nation or a group which existed in northern Iraq. However, through the Quran and the Sunnah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has elevated this group. Also, he was raised by the scholars. Also, he was raised on jihad. Also, he was raised on the right aqidah. Also, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given this man leadership. He's giving him intellect. He's giving him strength. He's giving him qualities of the leader that the Ummah needed at that time. Nuruddin Zanki, ikhwani, do not forget that name. He had so many nicknames. He was called Abu al-Qasim. And also he was called by the Muslims the just ruler, Al-Malik Al-Adil. And Layth al-Islam, the lion of Islam. And Al-Malik Al-Salih, the pious king. He was born in 511 Hijri, ikhwani. And he died in 569 Hijri. So in about 60 years, one Muslim man was able to change the face of the planet. Or at least the whole face of the Middle East. Let's find out, ikhwani, what this man did. This man, ikhwani, wasn't only focusing on the military side, he wasn't only focusing on the political side of the Muslims. He was also focusing on the iman of the believers, on the iman of the Muslims. At the same time that he was fighting the Crusaders' armies, he was also fighting ignorance, and fighting division, and fighting bad aqidah, and fighting job insecurities, and fighting bad health. He built hospitals, he built schools, he built nurseries, he built so many things to the and added so many things to the infrastructure of the Muslims that some of his buildings are still up in certain parts of the Muslim world today. If you go to the city of Damascus, this man's remains are still there. One of the other things, ikhwani, that this man built, just to show you the vision that this man had. However visionary he was, ikhwani, this man had one wish and one wish only, that Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa comes back to the Muslims. He wanted to pray in the Masjid Al-Aqsa. So to encourage his soldiers, he brought the best architects, the best woodwork people, people who work with wood, the carpentry people. and built the best minbar. Minbar is what's behind me, ikhwani, what the Imam uses on Salat al-Jumu'ah. He built the best minbar out of wood and decorated it with as many decorations as possible, and used to have it in public places and told the Muslims, this is the minbar which we will enjoy khutbah al-Jumu'ah on in al-Masjid al-Aqsa. Ikhwani, did you know that minbar, when the Muslims later, not in his time, later, at the time of Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, which we'll talk about next week inshallah, entered into Jerusalem, they brought the minbar of Nur ad-Din and placed it in al-Masjid al-Aqsa. Did you know that minbar stayed there for nearly 1,000 years? Up until 60 years ago, an Australian Zionist, out of all countries, Australian Zionist, decided to go all the way to Jerusalem, burn al-Masjid al-Aqsa, and he burnt the minbar of Nur ad-Din Zanki, rahimahullah. Can you imagine? This man's minbar, this man's vision, stayed in the city of Jerusalem for more than 1,000 years, ikhwani. At his time, ikhwani, he was surrounded by good Muslim leaders and bad Muslim leaders, just like today. So one of the bad Muslim leaders was the leader of Damascus, ikhwani. I will try to summarize it very quickly. This man had one concern. He just wanted his chair. He wanted to rule this city, and that's all he wanted. At any cost, that will take. So he decided to correspond with the Crusaders to make sure they protect Damascus for him against Nur ad-Din's forces. Nur ad-Din's trying to unite the Muslim Ummah, and here we have one leader of a city, corresponding from within the Muslim lands, corresponding with the Christians, telling them, come, send your armies, come, stay in Damascus, stay in this important city. However, I just want to rule the city. You guys can stay outside, protect it for me. And the Crusaders found it as an excellent opportunity. They sent their armies in, ikhwani, to help this man. The moment they got there, they declared that the city is theirs. So what happened now? This man who brought in the Christians to help him, and the Crusaders to help him, is now stuck with the Crusaders wanting his city. So he sends help for who? Nur ad-Din Zanki, rahimahullah. And Nur ad-Din Zanki, ikhwani, comes with the Mujahideen and eradicates the Crusaders. This leader of Damascus, ikhwani, done it about 3 times, up until the people within Ash-Sham, people within Damascus itself, rallied against him so much, called the armies of Nur ad-Din Zanki and forced the armies of Nur ad-Din Zanki in, and that Damascus, that main city, ikhwani. And I insist on us realizing how important this city is. Damascus, Dimashq, ikhwani. The Prophet ﷺ mentions Bilad al-Sham in the hadith. Why would he mention it? Why would the Muslims worry about Dimashq? Why would the non-Muslims always want to use Dimashq and take over Dimashq? Why is the whole West conspiring against the Muslims taking over Dimashq at the moment? Do not forget that name, Damascus and Dimashq, ikhwani. Here we have Nur ad-Din Zanki's forces, ikhwani, alhamdulillah, entering into Dimashq and turning it into their mini capital. And by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the forces of the Mujahideen were able to eradicate so many cities, Tripoli, Beirut, and so many other cities in Bilad al-Sham, in northern Iraq, in parts of Palestine itself. And whilst all this was happening, ikhwani, on eastern Palestine and eastern al-Masjid al-Aqsa, something interesting was happening on the western border. The Egyptians. The Egyptians at that time, ikhwani, majority Sunni, were ruled by a ruler from the Fatimiyin. However, this ruler, ikhwani, wasn't really a ruler. He had just a bit of a title, just like the royal family in Britain. You know, if there's a new building, she'll go cut that, thing. His photo will be on the coin. If they print anything, they'll put their photo. Something, like prestigious. But they had no real say in anything. And the rulers of Egypt were like that. Who had the power over Egypt, ikhwani, were ministers which were fighting amongst themselves for power. And there was 3 ministers where one minister managed to dominate. He killed one minister and he eradicated another minister. He drove him out of Egypt. So this minister, which was named Shawal, went all the way to Nur ad-Din, crossed Palestine, crossed a Christian country, went all the way to Nur ad-Din Zanki and told him, look, we need your help. I'm not like you, you're a mujahid, I'm a politician. All I want from you is send in your men, send in your soldiers, give me back my power, and I'll give you so much money you would not believe. And I know you need money to fight the Crusaders. Secondly, I'll allow you to operate from Egypt and surround the Crusaders. That way you have a higher chance of achieving your objective. I know what you want, Nuruddin. I know that you want Jerusalem, and I'm going to help you achieve that. Wallahi, Nuruddin Zanki weighed it out, Ikhwani. Paid his istikhara, done his mashwara, and his soldiers were ready. In the armies of Nuruddin Zanki were who? Salah ad-Din Ayyubi's father, his uncle, and Salah ad-Din himself and his brothers. Can you imagine the young army which Nuruddin had? What kind of quality did he have? And he sends off the Ayyubis to Egypt. And they crossed the Christian kingdom by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala safely. And cutting a long story short, in Egypt, they managed to take over power in Egypt. However, this minister caused them some grief, so they killed him. And they officially took over and became the ministers of Egypt. And by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Fatimi Khalifa or Fatimi king or ruler died. Only months after they took over. So they declared it again, once and for all, again a Sunnah country. From that day till today, it's remained as a Sunnah country. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. However, the Fatimiyin, who were ruling Egypt for about 200-300 years, weren't too happy about that. That constantly, and when I say Fatimiyin, there was Shia who had a particular methodology, a particular manhaj, particular aqidah. They were more strict than the normal Shia, and they had their own problems. They were continuously trying to eradicate Salah ad-Din's armies, assassinate him, etc. And they continued to plot towards him. This is what delayed the Muslims advancing towards the Crusaders. It wasn't because they weren't ready, they didn't have the manpower or the money or the willpower. It was because of the Fatimiyin behind our backs. I remember that, Ikhwani. Be careful of anyone behind your back, especially if it's a deviant group. Let's learn from history, Ikhwani. When we open up the books of history, we're not there just to entertain ourselves or listen about Salah ad-Din and what he did or Nur ad-Din. We're there to learn the lessons, Ikhwani, of those in the past. And we continue on, Ikhwani, and by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, now we have this young Islamic nation who were mujahideen. When the Muslims in Egypt saw the mujahideen from Bilad al-Sham, the soldiers of al-Sham come, it was a day of celebration for the Muslims of Egypt. That for the past centuries we did not see a Muslim soldier, a decent Muslim soldier, or a decent mujahid fi sabilillah. Now they're seeing these mujahideen, these salihin. It was a different taste, it was a different feel, Ikhwani. And by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, now we've unified Egypt with Bilad al-Sham, some of the largest and most powerful Muslim countries. When that happened, Ikhwani, the Arabian Peninsula, which was divided and they were fighting each other, Mecca and Medina declared their allegiance to Nuruddin Zanki. So now we've got this young nation, Mujahideen, who have Bilad al-Sham, Egypt, the Arabian Peninsula, the whole of Saudi Arabia as it's known today, declaring allegiance to Nuruddin. And Nuruddin is ruling all under the name of the Khalifa in Baghdad. So now for the first time in centuries, or in a couple of centuries, we have back a normal Sunni Khilafah, which actually rules on the ground. To continue that, we had all these mini cities join them. We had countries like Yemen, Bahrain, Oman, etc. join the new Muslim empire, if you want to use the word. Now, who's watching all this? The Crusaders. And they weren't too happy about it, Ikhwani. In the year 560, in the 563, 564, etc., after the unification, they constantly sent crusaders all the way from Europe. We had what we call a non-stop crusade, all the way from Europe down to Bilad al-Sham. Every time they'll gather enough people to fill up a ship, they'll fill up a ship, give them a few weapons, a bit of money, a bit of food, go. They'll fill up another ship, go. And they'll continuously sending their troops, their men, their women, wherever they can get their hands on to fight in Bilad al-Sham. Because, Ikhwani, they realized, so long that the Muslims united, under one leadership, under one commander, who can get in their way? You'll find, inshallah, next week as we'll talk about Salah ad-Din's army and what made him successful. That so many times he didn't have the greatest numbers. In fact, in the majority of his battles, his numbers did not exceed 12,000 soldiers. What made him successful, Ikhwani? What type of qualities did he have? What type of qualities did these armies have? We'll find that out next week, inshallah. After this great unification, Ikhwani, under the leadership of Nuruddin Zanki, rahimahullah, by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in 569 Hijri, by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Nuruddin Zanki, rahimahullah, passes away. He wasn't assassinated like his dad. They couldn't get through to him. Mind you, in the background of all this, I should have told you that the Hashashin were working day and night. That sent constant assassins on Salah ad-Din, on Nuruddin, on the leaders of the armies, on the Imam of the Muslims. However, by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has saved them from them. This great man, Ikhwani, Nuruddin Zanki, rahimahullah. And with that we'll stop tonight, inshallah. This great man who unified the Muslims. This great man who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him victory over the Crusaders. A great man where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him what he did not give so many people before him, Ikhwani. Do not forget that name, Ikhwani. So many times and so many days we think about other great rulers and other great Muslims. This great man, Nuruddin Zanki, rahimahullah, who died in Bilad al-Sham. I was buried in Bilad al-Sham. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He gives us Bilad al-Sham back one more time, inshaAllah. And Ikhwani, next week, inshaAllah, we'll continue with Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, the eradication of the Crusaders from Jerusalem, the second main crusade, the Crusaders of the Franks, and so on and so forth. Jazakumullah khair, Ikhwani. And before we finish, we want to make dua for the brothers and sisters in Syria at the moment, who are in Damascus, in Dimashq, Bilad al-Sham. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give him victory. Put up your hands, Ikhwani, and be as sincere as possible. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim wa barik ala Muhammadin wa ala ali Muhammad kama barakta ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim. اللهم انصر دينك وكتابك وسنة حبيبك وعبادك الصالحين. اللهم انصر المجاهدين في سوريا يا رب العالمين. اللهم انصر المجاهدين في سوريا يا رب العالمين. اللهم انصر المجاهدين في سوريا يا رب العالمين. اللهم افتح لهم فتحا مبينا يا رب العالمين. اللهم انصرهم على الطاغية يا رب العالمين. اللهم انصرهم ولا تنصر عليهم. أيدهم يا رب العالمين. اللهم كن معهم ولا تكن عليهم يا رب العالمين. اللهم زلزل الأرض من تحت أقدام أعدائك وأعدائهم يا رب العالمين. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. جزاكم الله خير والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. تقدم